Hello, in this lesson we're going to talk about kinetic energy and potential energy. Kinetic energy in chemistry is represented by Ke. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Kinetic energy can exist in various different forms. Most of the time, if we're looking at an atom, atoms in perhaps a solid state, we see that the atoms are bonded together and held together by really strong bonds. But if we were to add a little bit of heat energy, what we're actually doing is adding kinetic energy, because that heat energy causes the molecules to vibrate. The more heat energy there is, the more vibration there would be. So vibration is a form of kinetic energy. So if we had more heat, there'd be more kinetic energy, which would lead to more vibration, and therefore more motion. Another form of kinetic energy exists when we start looking at things in the gaseous state. Even in the liquid states, there is kinetic energy, the energy used to make sure that molecules slide past each other. But if we look at molecules or atoms in its gaseous state, and again, we add some more heat, we're going to see atoms and molecules moving around until they start to collide with each other. Okay? So the more energy there is, the more movement there is. The more movement there is, the more collisions there might be. So collisions between atoms and molecules is another form of movement, and therefore another form of kinetic energy. So we can say that an increase in heat will cause an increase in kinetic energy, which will cause an increase in collisions. Now, in contrast, potential energy is usually abbreviated as PE. Most people know that potential energy is stored energy. Okay, this stored energy, we tend to think of it as energy that could be used in chemical or physical changes. Okay. But if you're wondering where the energy is stored, the energy is actually stored. So energy is stored within the atoms and the bonds between atoms. So let me give you an example. If we take a look at two atoms that are bonded together, okay, for the sake of arguing, let's just say that these two are hydrogen atoms. The energy that's stored inside the bonds and within the atoms themselves, we're just going to say that that's all of our potential energy. So if we decide to add heat, okay, so adding heat, what's that going to do is cause the molecules to vibrate more at both ends. But if you give it enough energy, that bond will break. And when it breaks, those atoms will use that kinetic energy and move away from each other. So they separate. Okay? So all of that potential energy that was stored inside the bonds is now given to the molecules or atoms so that they can move away from each other to do work. So the energy allows them to separate. Now, if I just change my pen color here, if potential energy can be turned into kinetic energy in this way, what happens if we go backwards? Okay. What happens if two atoms start coming closer to each other? Right? So let's say they start coming closer to each other. Okay. The next thing that will happen is that instead of breaking bonds, they will start to form bonds. But in reality, what they're doing is they're taking that kinetic energy and they're trying to convert it back into potential energy. So in the process of forming bonds, we tend to lose heat instead of gaining heat. And then we arrive back at the beginning with atoms actually having bonds between them. Okay? And all that kinetic energy is now stored as potential energy. So energy is transferred. And conserved. Because kinetic energy can turn into potential energy, and potential energy can be converted back into kinetic energy. We'll talk a little bit more about this in our next lesson, but the relationship between kinetic energy and potential energy are inseparable. They're always there, and they're always together.